Hi, thank you for choosing to follow my talk. I'm Nikhil Paminati, a postdoctoral researcher at Polytechnic Milan, and today I'm here to present our research on evasion attacks against banking fraud detection systems. Let's start by having an overview of the banking fraud detection context. In recent years, the use of internet banking services has increased, allowing users to perform operations remotely. As a result, the number of fraud caused by cybercriminals has also increased, leading to millions of US losses every year. This raises basically the need for up-to-date fraud detectors, systems able to detect suspicious transactions. Modern fraud detection systems are based on machine learning and identify fraudulent transactions as deviation from historical users' behaviors, built on the basis of past transactions. As shown in the figure, when a user performs a transaction, this transaction is processed by the banking system and then classified by the machine learning algorithm. Besides the fraud detection domain, nowadays machine learning techniques are applied to other data-driven tasks, from image identification to malware and intrusion detection. While this system presents prominent benefits, such as a high detection rate, unfortunately, they all suffer from the typical weakness of machine learning models, since they are not designed with security in mind. In fact, it is possible to significantly reduce their robustness and alter their performances through adversarial samples, which are inputs crafted starting from legitimate samples that are iteratively perturbed to make the detector to misclassify them. Also, due to the transferability property, an attack against a machine learning model, so an undesired sample craft against one model can be effective also against another related but potentially unknown model. Therefore, an attacker, even without a comprehensive knowledge of a target detection system, can attack it by training a surrogate model and creating adversarial samples. This research area, called adversarial machine learning, has been studied mainly in the image classification field, in which, due to the intrinsic characteristics of images, researchers were able to achieve excellent results. For example, as shown in the image on the right, they were able to obtain adversarial images that were misclassified by the classifier, but at the human eyes, they basically seem identical to the original one. To the best of our knowledge, we are the first to study the application of adversarial machine learning techniques to the banking fraud detection context, which, unlike other domains, such as the image classification one, is characterized by samples with few features, with few aggregate features. This characteristic represents the first challenge in applying adversarial machine learning to the fraud detection context. Another challenge is represented by the fact that existing adversarial machine learning algorithms takes as input aggregated data and, perturbing the original features, return as output new aggregated data that is then misclassified. Instead, in the fraud detection domain, an attacker that wants to perform an adversarial machine learning attack, it doesn't need aggregated transaction, but raw transaction, since they represent the only input provided by the customer in the line banking application. Therefore, existing adversarial machine learning-based approaches are not directly applicable to our domain. As a consequence, in this work, we present a novel approach to perform evasion attacks against banking fraud detection systems that basically adapts and extends existing methods for crafting adversarial samples and mitigate the challenge of the domain under analysis. In particular, we define constraints in the perturbation during the execution of the adversarial machine learning methodology. An essential step in designing an adversarial machine learning-based attack is to define the threat model. In particular, we define the threat model in terms of the attacker's role, the attacker's knowledge, and the capability of manipulating data. So the attacker goal can be defined in terms of the security violation, the attack specificity, and the error specificity. In particular, since we are focusing on evasion attacks, the goal of attacker is against the integrity and the confidentiality of data, since he or she wants to carry out malicious transaction on behalf of the victim, and he or she wants to make the detector classifying these frauds as legitimate. In general, evasion attack can be both targeted and specific. Regarding attacker's capability, we model an attacker that wants to put in place an evasion attack by executing transactions on behalf of the user and manipulating the test set. Our approach in particular is based on three assumptions. The first assumption is that the attacker has a dataset of banking transactions for training the surrogate fraud detector. In particular, it has a generic dataset, and all dataset different from a fraud detector one that can be used to model this surrogate detector. The second assumption is that the attacker can retrieve or observe the transaction carried out by the victim and the funds availability. This assumption is necessary first to compute the related transaction and mitigate one of the limitations of this domain, and also for generating the evasive transaction themselves. Finally, the last assumption is that the attacker can execute transaction on behalf of the victim, and this assumption is necessary in order to inject frauds in the user spending activity. Considering the previous assumption, we define the attacker knowledge by extending the characterization made by Biggio et al., which they basically define the attacker's knowledge in terms of the training data, the feature set, the learning algorithm, and the trained parameters, the hyperparameters of the target fraud detection system. We extended this modelization by adding an additional term that represents the knowledge of the attacker with respect to past transactions of the victim. In fact, as already anticipated before, this knowledge is necessary to compute aggregated features used by the adversarial machine learning methods employed in this work. In particular, in our approach, the adversary just need to observe 1 month of target victim transaction, which in our dataset correspond to observe on average 20 transactions per victim. In a rare case, an attacker can simply retrieve this information by infecting the victim with a banking trojan. In summary, the attacker's knowledge is basically identified by all these elements. Based on the previous assumption, we model the attacker with 4 degrees of knowledge. A black box attack, a black box with data attack, a gray box attack, and a white box attack. In the black box attack, the attacker has no knowledge about the detection system and the training dataset. However, the attacker has at his or her disposal a set of transactions different from the one used by the target detection system. For example, an old leak dataset or a dataset belonging to another financial institution. In the black box with data, instead, the attacker has no knowledge about the detection system like before, but he or she has at his or her disposal the same training set used by the target system, consisting of all the banking transactions of the last months. In the gray box attack, in the gray box scenario, the attacker has now partial knowledge about the detection system. In particular, he or she knows about how the fraud detector aggregates data to compute features. However, he or she has no knowledge about the training data, the learning algorithm, and the trained hyperparameters. It is important to notice that in all this scenario, we assume that the attacker has at least retrieved past transaction of the user. These are necessary, again, to compute an approximation of aggregated features. The last scenario is the white box one. in which the attacker is assumed to know everything about the algorithm and the dataset used by the fraud detection system. Even if this is a strong limitation, a strong assumption, sorry, it is advantage to perform this kind of experimental evaluation in order to evaluate the worst case scenario against which evaluate your fraud detection system. With all this concept in mind, we can now present our approach, which is routed around the idea of generating evasive transaction by exploiting a surrogate fraud detector, which is called Oracle, that predicts the anomaly of a transaction. In other words, the Oracle is used to test candidate frauds with the idea that transactions that are not considered as fraudulent by the Oracle will likely be not flagged as fraud by the target fraud detector. Clearly, the Oracle is not 100% accurate, and its performance depends on the degree of attacker's knowledge explained before. Our approach, as shown in the diagram in the slide, is composed by two phases: a training phase in which we train the Oracle, and a runtime phase in which we generate the evasive transactions. During the training phase, we train the Oracle by aggregating historical transactions to build the surrogate fraud detector that approximate the target one. During the runtime phase, instead, depending on attacker knowledge, the attacker first observes and collects all the transactions executed by the victim. Based on information collected, the attacker generates raw candidate transactions. However, the attacker is subjected to a strong limitation, since he or she can directly modify only some features, while the others depend on the past behavior of the user or on the attack itself. So in theory, to generate candidate transaction, we should have efficiently explored the space of possible values of each transaction feature. In truth, the feature that the attacker can directly control are only the timestamp and the amount. Why this? Basically because the IBAN of the beneficiary, refers to a malicious recipient. Therefore, it's fixed, you cannot change it. It is a new IBAN never seen before in other transactions, while the IP and the autonomous system directly depend on the connection of the user, and therefore cannot be changed by the attacker. As a consequence, the only two variables that the attacker can modify are the amount and the timestamp. Regarding the amount, the choice of a value depends on the attacker's strategy, which can be conservative or risky. A too high amount would lead the Oracle to classify all the candidates as fraud. On the other hand, a too low amount does not allow the attacker to maximize the profit. For this reason, in a real-world scenario, the attacker should find a trade-off between the two. In this work, we decided to set up three different scenarios that represent the possible strategy that an attacker could use to choose the amount and the number of frauds to be committed. In the first scenario, the attacker has the goal to execute 20 transactions per user of 2,500 euros. So in this case, the idea is to execute a lot of transactions with a medium amount. In the second scenario, instead, the goal of the attacker is to execute less transactions, 10, with an amount of 10,000 euros. Therefore, in this case, you are executing fewer transactions with a medium-high amount. Finally, in the last scenario, the goal of attacker is to try to execute few transactions with a high amount in order to steal as much money as possible. In particular, in our scenario, the attacker tries to execute 5 transactions per user with an amount of 15,000 euros. Once the attacker has selected the amount to steal, he or she needs to identify the best time to perform the transaction. In other words, it has to select the timestamp. A naive approach would be to explore all the possible timestamps within the period in which the attack occurs, but this would be inefficient. To avoid this issue, we propose an approach that basically aims at finding the time windows in which the user is active. In fact, the attacker can observe user activity and select timestamps consequently. The output of this step is a raw candidate transaction. It is aggregated with the previous transaction and given an input to the trained oracle for the classification phase. In particular, the oracle classifies each candidate transaction, and if it is labeled as fraud, we are going to discard it. Otherwise, if it is labeled as legitimate, we are going to use it in the evasion attack by injecting it in the user banking activity. Let's now move to experimental evaluation. We worked on two real datasets provided by an important Italian banking group, one from 2012, the other from 2012 to 2014, and the other from 2014 to 2015. They both contain 500,000 transactions from 50,000 users. The basic features contained in these datasets were the transaction amount, the time and the date of execution of the transaction, basically timestamp, the hashed IP address of the connection from which the transaction is performed, the hashed international bank account number, the IBAN of the beneficiary, and the autonomous system from which the connection comes. From this basic feature, we derived a set of aggregated features that are shown in the second table in the slides. For experimental evaluation, Oracle and fraud detection are characterized by the machine learning employed, the dataset used for training the model, and the feature extraction strategy adopted. In the table in the slide, we provide details about these selections. We can notice how the oracle is always based on a random forest algorithm, which, as confirmed by the literature and by the experiment we perform in our dataset, has the best performance in the fraud detection task. This is, except for Oracle 2, all the other oracles are trained with an older dataset, the one from 2012 to 2013, since, as already explained, the attacker is in possession of an old dataset, different from the one used by the fraud detectors of the bank. Oracle 2, it will be used for a black box with data attack and for a white box attack. For fraud detectors, instead, we tried to use the most common solution used in the state of the art. Therefore, we use a random forest detector, neural network-based detector, extreme gradient boosting detectors, detectors based on logistic regression, and also detectors based on active learning, which they basically combine unsupervised methods such as autoencoder and random forest, and Bayesian, which is an ensemble method that combines statistical techniques, machine learning techniques based on clustering, and pressure-based techniques to provide an anomaly score. In particular, this last detection system is also employed in the Italian banking group with which we collaborate. Basically, we perform an attack for each scenario, degree of knowledge of attacker, and algorithms described previously. The combination of oracles and detectors per degree of knowledge are summarized in the table on the left in these slides. We inject a number of frauds approximately equal to 1% of transactions in the dataset. We use to train the fraud detector, we use as dataset to train the fraud detector, the one from 2014 to 2015, using the month from October to January, while February, the last month of this dataset, is the one subject to the evasion attacks. It is interesting to notice how we select randomly the victims of these attacks, excluding those users with less than 5 transactions in the dataset. We perform each experiment 10 times and compute the average value for each metric in order to have a more reliable estimate of attack and not biased by the selected user. We evaluate the evasion performances using 4 methods: the injection rate, the evasion rate, the attack detection rate, and the money stolen. So the injection rate basically indicates the percentage of candidate frauds that the oracle classified as legitimate with respect to the total number of candidate frauds generated by the attacker. With evasion rate, we measure the percentage of frauds concealed from the fraud detection system with respect to the total frauds injected. The attack detection rate instead measures the percentage of attacks that are detected by the fraud detection system. Finally, the money stolen metric represents the money in euro that the bank loses due to the attack. This metric is significant because it depends on all the three previous metrics and the attack strategy of attackers. Also, it gives an idea of the monetary impact that these attacks can have on a real bank. And here are the results. Regarding the black box attack, the best strategy for the attacker is the one represented in scenario 3. In fact, except for the case in which the fraud detector is based on logistic regression and on by Sear, in scenario 3, the attacker gets a detection rate values lower than in the other two scenarios, and with a much higher values in terms of money stolen. The values of evasion rate instead remain stable in all three scenarios, except in the case where the attack is directed to the hybrid fraud detector, the active learning one. This detector achieves excellent results in terms of evasion rate and attack detection rate, especially in scenario 1, where the attack is always detected with an attack detection rate of 100%. The performance of this fraud detector decreased significantly with the increase of the amount of frauds. In fact, in scenario 3, the attack detection rate is reduced to 36%. There was fraud detectors before, which in scenario 1 is completely evaded. Models B2 and B3 instead obtain very similar values in all the metrics for all the scenarios. The performance of the attack against it remains also perfect in the other two scenarios. Very similar results were obtained in the black box with data scenario. In fact, strategy 3 still remains the best strategy for the attacker. Still, the fraud detector the best counteract the attack are B1, the one based on random forest, and B5, the one based on active learning, which basically achieve an evasion rate of 35 and 56% respectively, against the 90% of all the other detectors. Again, the fraud detector before, the one based on logistic regression, is the one that is easier to evade in all three scenarios. Still in the gray box attacker, we obtain the very similar results in which scenario 3 remains the best scenario for the attacker. The worst attack performance are obtained in scenario 2 against fraud detector B1, which has an attack detection rate of 93% and an evasion rate of 52%. It is interesting to notice how there is a significant deterioration in the detection performance of the active learning detector, which has an evasion rate of 90% and a detection rate of 28%, values which are much lower than those obtained in the other settings. Detector before, instead, is easily evaded, with an evasion rate of 100%. Finally, in the white box attack, in which the attacker has a complete knowledge of a fraud detector, we can perform a perfect attack with a 100% evasion rate and a 0% detection rate. The most effective attack is obtained again against model before, the one based on logistic regression, in which in scenario 3 leads to the bank to a loss of about 23 billions of euro. Good performance are instead obtained by the detector B6, Bankseer 1, the one deployed by the bank, that in scenario 2 and 3 significantly reduce the losses of the bank. If we analyze the result globally, we can notice how logistic regression-based models are the easiest to evade. Random forest models instead and active learning models are the most challenging to evade. Another interesting result is related to the fact that the increase of attacker knowledge does not significantly increase the attack success rate, except for the full knowledge scenario. Finally, ensemble approach seems to be more resistant to white box attack, reducing money loss. In conclusion, in this work, we develop another approach to perform evasion attack against fraud detection system under different degree of knowledge and simulating the behavior of different types of fraudsters. Future works will focus on deploying poisoning attacks and on studying the transferability on different but related datasets. Also, Another interesting works will focus on study the impact of evasion attacks on other performance metrics, such as the false positive. If you have any question or feedback regarding our work, feel free to reach me out on my email that is shown on this slide. Thank you very much.